Dan and Amy, so why is your town out of money? Seems to be an appropriate question to ask about Illinois as well as it does other states. Normally, the discussion is about unfunded pension liabilities. A lot of discussion in this state about pension pushdown to local school districts. With the largest unfunded pension liability in the country, you can understand why people are focused there, in addition to what we just saw and we talked about last week with North Riverside moving to try and privatize their fire department because they cannot afford to keep up with the pension payments that are required for their retired firefighters. But that's just one problem, at least according to Chuch Marohn at strongtowns.org, who has a very interesting piece called "The Real Reason Your City Has No Money," and it's because of growth Ponzi schemes. What is that? We're pleased to be joined by Chuch Marohn to decipher that for us. Chuck, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So you mentioned Lafayette, Louisiana as kind of a case study in this piece that I'm referring to at strongtowns.org, "The Real Reason Your City Has No Money." And it ultimately gets to this problem that extends well beyond this case study of Lafayette, Louisiana, to growth Ponzi schemes that have been embarked upon by local units of government in concert with the state and federal government since World War II. Can you kind of break this down for us?
Yeah. Well, before World War II, growth and development was largely a local concern. If we were going to have growth in our neighborhoods and our cities, that was going to happen at the local level. It was going to happen kind of slow and incrementally and be, in a sense, like resilient. I mean, you weren't going to build stuff at the local level that you couldn't afford to take care of. After really the Depression of World War II, we had morphed our economy so that growth at the local level was something that was a shared responsibility between cities and then state and federal government. And for a lot of reasons having to do with national economic statistics, we needed to grow our economy. And from the federal level, we started to pump money into things like infrastructure and roads and sewers and what have you. At the local level, what this did is it gave us a lot of growth. I mean, cities grew outward very quickly. But in the process, they took on a lot of promises, a lot of liabilities. We'll fix that pipe. We'll fix that road. We'll come back and repair that sidewalk a generation from now. You saw in the 70s and 80s how when things started to slow down, what a lot of governments did is they made these promises, and you mentioned pensions. When we didn't have the money to make good on everything that we did, we basically took on debt and then said, we'll pay you later. We'll catch up with you in the future because, we're going to grow and everything will work out well. The reality is now we're here today, and when we look at a city like Lafayette or others that we've modeled around the country, what we see is that they have so much liability in the ground, so many things that they promised to do in order to attract all that growth, that there's no possible way they can fix it and maintain it all. They're literally insolvent and going broke.
And this is particularly relevant because we're talking about an incoming administration and an incoming president that has talked about another $1 trillion infrastructure program, as we've seen from previous administrations.
There's no doubt. And I think, one of the dangers today is to look back at the 50s and 60s in this country, which, the last election was a lot about for both candidates. Looking back at that time period and saying, this was the glory days of America, what did we do then? Well, we spent money on infrastructure, so let's go do that again, and America will be great again. And, yes, at the federal level, it's pretty easy to create GDP growth and lower unemployment in the short term if you're going to spend $1 trillion building stuff. The problem is our local governments take on those liabilities long term. I mean, the promises, the old economist adage, you dig a ditch and you fill it back in,
right,
works in terms of creating jobs. But when you build a bridge, you don't end up where you started. Now you have a bridge that you have to maintain forever. And those maintenance promises stack up at the local level, and they're just bankrupting our cities.
So in your article, you focused on Lafayette, Louisiana. What did you learn by focusing on that city?
Well, Lafayette is the place where we developed the most detailed data. We've modeled hundreds of cities around the country. And I think the big question we had intellectually going into Lafayette was, does this modeling we've done kind of correlate when we get a really, really deep data set? And in fact, it did. And in neighborhoods and, in some of our course modeling in other cities really translates around the country. Lafayette is a pretty average place. There's nothing extraordinary about it. I mean, I love it. It's a beautiful Cajun kind of culture. It's a great place to hang out. But from its development pattern, it's very normal. It's got an old downtown. It's got surrounding neighborhoods. It's got all the big box stores and drive-through restaurants and everything you'll find in every major city. The fact is, though, the taxes in Lafayette would need to go up 400% just to tread water, just to maintain what they have. And there's no way that can happen, not just politically, but just, we're not going to spend $1 out of every $5 that people make maintaining infrastructure. And so that, it's a lesson that translates everywhere, because I suspect, based on what we've seen in other places, that Lafayette is nowhere near the worst.
Well, and so the other issue with this, you talk about kind of federal and state doing this in concert with local, is perverse incentives to spend money you wouldn't otherwise spend. So I think, for example, of a particular boondoggle, in my estimation, that's been advanced in Illinois and the Midwest for the last several years, high-speed rail. Because the real problem in Illinois is we can't get to Toledo fast enough. And so we're willing to spend $10 billion. But, the federal government's going to come in and provide a quarter of the upfront funding for that. Well, we're a state that has $11 billion in unpaid bills and $250 billion in debt. But because we're incentivized, because we're going to get a quarter from the federal government up front, then we're going to go spend another $7 billion we don't have. I mean, you see that kind of replicating itself throughout the country.
Yeah, Illinois is a special case of crazy.
Well, of course it is.
I say that kindly.
Yes.
It is a kind of a crazy thing. What we see is that the way the federal government measures success is year to year. So can we create jobs right now? Can we increase the GDP right now? And infrastructure is a great way to do that. I mean, it's been proven over time that when you go out and spend money on high-speed rail or new bridges or even going out and building frontage roads and what have you, you create a lot of growth at the federal level, and that results in tax receipts and people getting reelected and ribbon cuttings and what have you. But the liabilities, the promises, if you were keeping a balance sheet, which, by the way, local governments don't do, if you were keeping a balance sheet at the local level, you would see that we're just racking up all these long-term promises. And that is not reflected anywhere in the federal government's accounting.
Right.
When I'm a civil engineer. I worked many years doing projects exactly like you described. There are things that we would never do at the city level. They would be absurd. We would never consider doing them. But because we can get 80%, 90% funded by the federal government, now all of a sudden it's just a matter of how do you come up with that local match. And we'll, stretch to do that, and we'll borrow money, and we'll raise taxes, and we'll put off other projects, like maintaining critical things in order to get this money. But then at the end of the day, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, someone has to come back and fix all that.
Well, so the question is, with respect to all this infrastructure, like with respect to pensions, where we're at now, is where do we go from here? Do we start raising sewer systems and bridges? Obviously not. So what do we do?
Well, it's interesting because problems have solutions, and we tend to treat these things like they're problems with a solution. Predicaments have outcomes, and we've actually moved beyond problems now to where we're dealing with predicaments. I mean, we've created for ourselves a big predicament, and there really isn't a solution. There's a lot of outcomes. I think the urgency that we see right now is if we're going to spend $1 trillion at the federal level, let's not spend this money making this predicament worse. Let's actually start dealing with some of the transition costs. So at the city level, we're going to have to make some difficult decisions about what we maintain and what we don't. That seems bizarre to us, yet you only have to look a little bit east of you guys to Detroit to see a city that really, in essence, got started 2 decades earlier doing this kind of development pattern and arrived at the logical destination a couple decades ahead of everybody else. They've had to make those difficult decisions there. We don't have enough money to maintain and fix everything. What do we let go? What do we not do? How do we start to change as a city?
Yeah, and I mean, and Detroit was scarifying the roads and turning kind of white elephants into farmland. I mean, so
Yeah, they have organic farming there.
I mean, it may be a dystopian. It's not a Cormac McCarthy novel anymore. It's the future.
It is, and Detroit, whatever your kind of messed up political narrative is, you can apply it to Detroit. And I think that that's sad because there's so many lessons to be learned in Detroit. Back in the early 1900s, Detroit was one of the top 5 cities of the world.
Yeah,
it was a spectacular place, and they kind of led the way in the United States in ripping up our neighborhoods and running highways through the middle of them and moving everybody out to the edge. And they just reached the insolvency that creates a lot quicker than the rest of us have. He
is Chuch Marohn from strongtowns.org. He's the founder and president of strongtowns.org. Really good stuff, very interesting. It's worth checking out the real reason your city has no money and multiple parts to that. Chuch Marohn, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. You guys take care.
Yeah, you too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.